we all know the history of Columbus, who traveled southwest of Europe in 1492, looking for a shortcut to Asia, the Spice Islands, China. Of course, he made the preliminary findings of what proved to be a whole hemisphere of continental dimension, North and South America. And the imperial powers began their probes, colonial ventures, imperial ventures. About 80 years after Columbus, once the eastern definition of North and South America was becoming more clearly refined, the quest that initially impelled Columbus to travel southwest resumed. In other words, the desire of establishing a shortcut sailing west from northern Europe rather than around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean, that desire never went away. And so the initial probes for the search for a Northwest Passage, which meant to be a passage through or around or above North America that would still get to the Spice Islands or China, that resumed in about 1580. And the names of all of those early explorers dot the geography of Atlantic Canada: Baffin, Frobisher, Davis Strait, and most famous of all, Hudson. All of which efforts, of course, came to naught because they either ran into more continent or prodigious amounts of ice. And so after a couple centuries of failure, and more particularly after word reached Western Europe that Russia was extending into the North Pacific by way of a Siberian extension, the thought began to rummage around in Western Europe. Maybe we're looking for the Northwest Passage on the wrong side of North America. And so we'll start here with this image, which was published in 1753. It drew heavily on Vitus Bering's news of Vitus Bering's voyages in the late 1730s, 1740s. And once word percolated, particularly to Paris, cartographers began to pay more attention to what might be called the backside of North America. That is the Pacific side. Geographic speculation always being a favorite habit of geographers, both real and hypothetical. This west coast of North America is just a hodgepodge of real and imagined notions. California is down at the bottom of the center. It's a long peninsula. The central point of the image, and I want you to remember this, this will be important because it won't be easy to come back to it in the slide progression. Right in the center of the way this image is cropped is a body of water called the Mer or Baie de l'Ouest, or Baie de l'Ouest. This being a favorite French cartographic notion, which was this giant inland sea, maybe 2.5 times the size of Hudson Bay, which is viewable off to the northwest of the Bay of the West. And so, again, the Russians start spreading eastward to the west coast of North America, which begins to bring focus to the backside of North America. This was the last map published before Captain Cook ventured off on his third and final voyage. Several noteworthy aspects of it here. It emphasizes, because it was based on Russian sources, it was actually published earlier than that in Germany and in Russia. It was published, the English version, which you see here, was published in 1775, the year before Cook left on his third voyage. No doubt the most noteworthy aspect of this image, you can see Kamchatka, you see the eastern extension of Siberia, Russia, and then there's this hazy congelation of islands, which are probably some vague echo of what we know as the Aleutian chain. But the largest of them, there at the top in the center, between the East Cape of Asia and the western tip of North America, as it was then conceived, is the island of Alaska. This, by the way, was the first time that word had ever appeared in the English language on this map, in the English version of Jacob von Staelen's book that recounted Russian exploration extending eastward from Siberia towards the Aleutians, towards North America. Remember this image too, because it'll feature prominently in the Cook story. This is an inset from a larger map that shows Cook's track over 3 voyages. But this is the Pacific Basin inset from the larger map. And of course, Cook, having already conducted 2 epic voyages to the South Pacific, one starting in 1769 to view the transit of Venus, during which he established the dual insularity of New Zealand that you can see there in the lower left. And he established the east coast of what is billed as New Holland, the west side of which had already been discovered by Dutch navigators more than 100 years before Cook. The map, for the first time, showed the spatial width of the Pacific Ocean. You can see South America pretty well defined. But for our purpose, what Cook was able to establish with his 3rd voyage, and he reached our waters here off of the coast of Oregon in March of 1778. Cook established a generally northwesterly trend line of the northwest coast. Again, you'll recall that first map I showed where there was this huge bay generally trending northeast, very conducively closer to Europe, rather than the northwesterly projection of North America that Cook faithfully depicted. You can also see the subcontinental dimensions of Alaska, which Cook was the first to faithfully record. You can also see the close juxtaposition of the far east coast of Cape of Russia and Cape Prince of Wales, the westernmost point of Alaska, which is just a dozen or so leagues separating one another. Cook, of course, sailed through this narrows, what we know as Bering Strait, attempting to sail over the top of North America, again, establishing the Northwest Passage by traveling west to east as opposed to east to west, as had been the norm. But like all of his predecessors in Atlantic Canada, he hit the well-established ice pack, briefly tried to reach England by sailing over the top of Russia, hit the ice again, turned around, headed south to Hawaii, which he had first encountered on his way north. And of course, he was killed there on February 14th, 1779. The 14th is what? Next Wednesday, I believe. That will be the anniversary of the original St. Valentine's Day massacre. Cook, of course, was killed at Kealakekua Bay on February 14th, 1779. But he left a great cartographic legacy, of which, again, this is an inset, and which in my book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, I refer to as the first modern map of the world. And not that there are not imperfections, because of course there are. Australia is not exactly shaped like that. Alaska is not exactly shaped like that because he didn't see the north slope of Alaska. He hit the ice. But anyone looking at Cook's map of 1784, published at the conclusion of the 3rd voyage, 4 years after his colleagues returned to Great Britain, anyone looking at the larger map of Cook's track over 3 voyages, looking at that map would say, yes, that looks like my normal understanding of the world's geography, which is why I call Cook's track map the first modern map of the world. But one of the interesting cartographic details in Cook's map is that he not only established, looking for the Northwest Passage, probed Prince William Sound, named by him, Cook Inlet, where Anchorage is located, Anchorage, Alaska. Anchorage is named Anchorage because Cook anchored in Cook Inlet, except Cook didn't think Cook Inlet was an inlet. He thought it was an outflow of a major river, much like the Bay of St. Lawrence is an outflow of the St. Lawrence River, which is a river system Cook had become familiar with, having fought for the Royal Navy during what we call the French and Indian War. So, although Cook's mistakes are exaggerated on his 3rd voyage, this was unquestionably one because he seeded the idea in the minds of terrestrial fur traders and also maritime fur traders that there was a river that emptied out at Cook Inlet, again, where Anchorage, Alaska is, that had its roots, its origins, its headwaters deep into the northwest of Northwest America. That was a false construct but it propagated a great deal of interest by fur traders. Initially, Peter Pond, whose map you see here, published in 1790 in Great Britain in Gentleman's Magazine. And if you look closely at this, you can see Pond, he's hypothetically worked out a network of rivers and lakes from the western tip of Lake Superior in the very lower right-hand corner through some lakes and rivers to the northwest of the continent. We can see Great Slave Lake. And from Great Slave Lake, you see a river flowing north, which he imagined, to the Arctic Ocean, and another river flowing west with outlets at Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet. This set a whole host of terrestrial explorers, principally Pond and his successor, Alexander Mackenzie, on a wild goose chase looking for the headwaters of Cook's River somewhere in the vicinity of what would now be the modern day border between British Columbia and Yukon. Of course, no such river system exists, but then again, this was the geography of hope at work. One of the inadvertent aspects of Cook's third voyage is that at Nootka Sound on what's now the west coast of Vancouver Island, where Cook stopped for wood and water in the spring of 1778, his men, knowing they were heading to the icy latitudes, acquired every bear pelt, fox skin, and principally sea otter pelt they could from the local indigenous people for warm weather gear, which they used, having no idea until near the end of the voyage when they stopped at Kamchatka, and then more prominently when they stopped in the vicinity of Canton, modern Hong Kong, that the pelts they acquired at Nootka Sound for a nail or a button would sell for 100 Spanish dollars in the Chinese market. This, of course, once news of this commercial development was popularized, both by word of mouth and more particularly in the published account of Cook's third voyage, which came out in 1784, and that's where the map dates to as well, set off a virtual rush of maritime fur traders heading to the coast that Cook had explored. Now, this map is from John Mears, published about the same time as Peter Pond's map. In fact, if you can see either Pond's map influenced the design of this map or this map that influenced the design of Pond's, because again, if you look in the upper left corner, you see Slave Lake with an outflow to the north, presumably the Arctic, and an outflow to the west, again flowing into Prince William Sound or Cook Inlet. But I call your attention in particular to the lower left, where you can see that the visits by Mears and several dozen other maritime fur traders showed that the coastline, which Cook had no interest in, Cook's zone of discovery was the high latitudes. He was not looking for a northwest passage at 46 north, where the Columbia River is, nor 48 north, where the Strait of Juan de Fuca is, or 49, 50, or any of those latitudes. He sailed off that coast. He didn't begin his search basically until he got to Prince William Sound. But his map, although inadvertently conveyed the idea that the northwest coast was kind of a simple line that generally trended in a northwesterly direction. But as you can see in Mears's map here, and another one I'm going to show you soon, that the Pacific Northwest coastline is very intricate, maybe even labyrinthine. There are many openings, many inlets, and you get some sense of this. But also, if you look closely, inland, you see in the left the chart. You see the title of the chart. If you look to the right of that, and inland over where you would expect to see Vancouver Island, you can see in Mears's chart the sea. In other words, within 15 years of Captain Cook, the idea of that great inland sea that one entered off the Pacific Ocean had resurrected itself, again, a function of the geography of hope. So Cook had been sent looking for a saltwater Northwest Passage, thus he tried to get over the top of North America. When the fur traders coming in, like Mears here, began to see that, this coastline was more complicated than maybe Cook's chart would have led you to believe, the idea resurrected itself that maybe there was a mid-latitude Northwest Passage that is worth exploring. This chart was the last published chart in Great Britain prior to George Vancouver's expedition. Now, in this map, you can really see in the lower right-hand corner all of the intricacy of a Northwest coast. Not a hint of it really apparent in Cook's chart from 1784. In fact, in the very lower right-hand corner, you can see the very first intimations of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. By the time this was published, Vancouver Island hadn't been discerned its insular nature nor its name, because Vancouver was in these waters when this map was published. There you can see Great Slave Lake, the Alaska Peninsula, the Aleutian Islands are better defined than in some earlier schemes. But again, and then there's much like Mears's map, there's some very fine script behind the words Northwest Georgia, which was the name for this terrain using the British nomenclature, is some script that indicates that maybe there is a large oceanic inlet in these latitudes, which, because it would narrow the distance between the Pacific waters and the Atlantic waters by way of Hudson Bay, would create a narrow neck of land that would be much simpler to traverse as a second generation Northwest Passage than the one Cook's third voyage had seemingly ruled out. By the way, this map, I don't know how intimate many of you are with the construction of engraved maps, but this chart, the original, was inscribed in the original copper plate that was used to. This was billed as a chart of North America dating to Cook, although it was published almost 20 years after Cook was in the water. So the engraver hammered out or flattened, smoothed out the Northwest coast, and then re-engraved the intricacy. In the upper left there, you can see the remnants of the original engraving, which shows Cook's track through the Bering Strait, an attempt over Alaska, which was thwarted, westward over Russia, which was thwarted, and then heading back down south to the Aleutians and thence to Hawaii. So, the Cook's first generation attempt to look at the Northwest Passage from the Pacific. Now the maritime fur traders and the terrestrial fur traders have resurrected the idea of a second generation Northwest Passage in the mid-latitudes. This is the true origin, that problem is the true origin of the George Vancouver expedition. Vancouver was not sent to the Northwest coast to make up for any faults or errors in cartography from Cook's third, although it's commonly asserted so by historians of the Pacific Northwest. Again, because Cook was not even beginning a search for the Northwest Passage until he got to Prince William Sound at about 60 north. Cook's instructions basically were to hit the California coast and just keep the continent to his right all the way until he got back to the latitudes of Cook Inlet, looking for this great inland ocean that we saw very initially in the very first chart. And of course, he finds no such thing because, as we all know, because of our normative understanding of North American geography, there are inlets into the North American interior. Vancouver here is the first one to provide a hint, more than a hint. He actually delineated the general outline of Puget Sound, Admiralty Inlet. He established the insularity of what we know as Vancouver Island, and you can see the labyrinthine nature of the northern British Columbia coast, the Alaska Panhandle, all the way up to Cook Inlet, which he determined was not the outfall of a major river, but in fact it was an inlet, and correcting that what was indeed an error on Cook's part. So therefore, to sum up, Cook's looking for Northwest Passage version 1, can't find it because the ice blocks his way. Vancouver is sent out to establish definitively whether this replacement idea, the Western Bay that's an analog to Hudson Bay, he proves definitively that doesn't exist. But the idea of the Northwest Passage has such a grip on the imagination that a third version of the Northwest Passage emerges, and that's what we'll discuss in the next few slides. This many of you will recognize as Alexander Mackenzie's track map. The Pacific Coast, this was published in 1801. And in fact, it was this map that alarmed Thomas Jefferson and resulted in sending him to Lewis and Clark out this way, but I'll get to that shortly. You'll see that the West Coast draws on the cartography from Vancouver, published in 1798. Vancouver, again, was in these waters, our waters, Northwest Coast, 1792, 93, and 94. Mackenzie publishes this in 1801 after, in 1789, following the track of the water flowing out of Great Slave Lake. You remember Peter Pond's speculative map. Mackenzie is Pond's protege. He sails out of Great Slave Lake, but rather than that river taking him to Cook Inlet, you can see here it takes him instead to the Arctic Ocean, thus not a workable Northwest Passage. He returns not only to Montreal, but to Great Britain, takes training and more accomplished surveying, and tries a second time in 1793. And that's the path you see depicted in the middle left, where he hits a river, is told by the native people that it's very perilous navigating these waters. And so Mackenzie instead cuts cross lots, heads directly to the Pacific coast, reaches tidewater in the summer of 1793 near what's now Bella Coola, Washington. I'm sorry, Bella Coola, British Columbia. And publishes this map as well as a whole narrative of his two voyages, 1789 to the north, 1793 to the Pacific, and in his concluding paragraphs tells his readers, one of whom would become Thomas Jefferson, that he has established a productive fur trading path that would traverse from the Atlantic via Montreal on the St. Lawrence to the Pacific Tidewater that he reached there just north of Vancouver Island. And he says, by way of this track, it will be possible for British companies and the British Empire to dominate the North American fur trade and prevent the Americans, who of course have a new country, from interloping into this profitable trade. And it is those paragraphs, when Jefferson reads them, that convinces him he needs to get his guys in the field. We know that as the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, this map was prepared for Lewis and Clark's use in the field. It's called King's Map, after Nicholas King, who was the principal cartographer for the War Department. Again, on the west to the left, you will see, based again on Vancouver's exquisite cartography, you'll see a reasonably accurate definition of the Oregon coast, Vancouver Island, Strait of Juan de Fuca, Puget Sound. You'll see a stream coming down from the north that seems to exit at about 46 degrees north. Mackenzie thought that was the Columbia River, the mouth of which, of course, had been discovered by one of those maritime fur traders I talked about earlier, Robert Gray. The stream that Mackenzie was on was actually the Fraser River, but neither he nor Lewis and Clark or any geographer would know that until 1808, until Simon Fraser sailed down the river Mackenzie started on, only to realize it was the river that's named after him, not the Columbia, which originates in the Canadian Rockies farther to the east. But in any event, the principal feature in this map that I want to focus on is that if you look to the southwest of Lake Superior, and Lake Michigan, in fact, due west of Lake Michigan, you will see the word conjectural. This was the notion, again, the geography of hope always being a major defining element of the history of the Northwest Passage. This is a conjectural projection of what was imagined to be the great South Fork of the Columbia River. Look how nice and simple that is. You get a dozen, 15, 20 degrees west of Lake Superior. You go up the Mississippi, Missouri River, and voila, there is a conjectural South Fork of the Columbia River that will take you all the way to the mouth of Robert Gray's River, named after Gray's ship, the Columbia, at 46 degrees north. And this is kind of the geographic conception of the American version of Mackenzie's Overland Northwest Passage that was in Jefferson's mind and Meriwether Lewis's mind when he left Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1803. The geography, of course, is completely antithetical to the geography of hope you saw in Nicholas King's projection. This is William Clark's map of the American West, published in 1814 with the first edition of the Lewis and Clark journals. I can't think of a cartographic image that is more inimical to the idea of a Northwest Passage conducive to trade from the Atlantic side of the continent to the Pacific than what Clark was able to depict with reasonable degree of fidelity here in this image. And so, therefore, version 1 of the Northwest Passage, the one Cook was sent to find, couldn't find it. Version 2, the one that the fur traders propagated, that Vancouver was sent to authenticate, that doesn't exist. Version 3, originally propagated by Pond, refined by Mackenzie, and sought exhaustively by Lewis and Clark, an overland version of a river and stream version of a Northwest Passage, that doesn't exist either. The idea of moving commerce from Europe through or across North America to Asia, or from the Atlantic side of North America across the continent to Asia, the dream did not die. And so basically what happened is that when nature failed to provide a Northwest Passage, when nature failed to provide a Northwest Passage, one was constructed in the form of the transcontinental railroads. The map you see here is from Isaac Stevens' Pacific Railroad Report, published in volume 11 of the Pacific Railroad Reports in 1857. It shows several projected routes for a railroad from the Rocky Mountains west to Puget Sound, mouth of the Columbia River, Olympic Peninsula. That topography is pretty reasonably well projected here. Stevens was one of 4 surveyors sent into the field in 1853, 4 years after the California Gold Rush, when there was a policy imperative to try to link the burgeoning American population on the Pacific slope in Oregon and California with a larger population base in the eastern half of the country. And so railroad technology had emerged in the 1830s, increasingly sophisticated, so that by the early 1850s, it was conceived that we could actually link the continent by rail, since nature had, we can cross the continent by rail, since nature had failed to provide such a linkage. What is interesting about Stevens so Stevens had the northernmost survey. There were 3 south of him. By the way, the Secretary of War that commissioned these surveys was one Jefferson Davis, who, just to get to the end of this story, determined that the most practicable of the 4 routes the various surveyors were sent to establish was the most southern one that ended in New Orleans. Big surprise there. But Stevens's railroad survey is significant because it's the only one of the 4 that was consciously modeled in the tradition of the Northwest Passage. In fact, Stevens's report, published after this map was issued, his geographical memoir published in 1860, and generally throughout his report, he continually made references to the fact that his line was the most auspicious because it was shorter, given the curvature of the Earth. By way of the Great Circle route, provided the easiest link to the Asian market Of course, none of these surveys, none of these routes, including the one Stevens surveyed, was built in the 1850s because the country was fractured by the sectionalism that eventuated in the Civil War. After the Civil War, several transcontinental lines were built, including the first being the UP and Central Pacific at a more southerly line, principally because the California connection was deemed more vital than the one to Puget Sound. Although the Northern Pacific was in fact chartered during the Lincoln administration, and it was the second line to reach the Pacific coast. Now the Canadians had the very same idea, although they were a little late. The Canadian impulse was driven by the fact that British Columbia had been admitted as a province in 1870 to the Canadian Confederation, basically to keep it from falling into the lap of the Americans, since so much of the Canadian prairie was then unpopulated, what's now Saskatchewan, Alberta, etc. And so Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, promised British Columbia that if they joined Confederation, they would build a railroad linking BC to the rest of Canada. And that took the form of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, there's one particular, and all of the same arguments about transcontinental trade, trans-Pacific trade, infused the debate, the capitalization of the CPR. I call your attention in particular on this map. At the far western end of the line, you'll see what was projected early on as the terminus of the CPR. You see that it's named Port Moody. And indeed, a Port Moody, I think, still exists in some form, but it was considered rather nondescript, not terribly grandiose. So the general manager of the CPR, a man by the name of William Cornelius Van Horn, determined that the western terminus needed a more dignified name than Port Moody, and so he named it Vancouver. And in his message to the board of directors of the CPR said that Vancouver was a more fitting name because the railroad fulfilled the promise of imagined in the Northwest Passage that Captain Vancouver had been sent out to find over 100 years earlier. Of course, while in the years after Cook, no one paid a lot of attention to the Arctic because Cook's experiences were considered dispositive. The dream of finding some hint of a saltwater route across the top of North America, that continued to linger. It wasn't there was no great utilitarian value to a Northwest Passage in the 1840s and 1850s. It was kind of like the saying about Mount Everest, why climb it? Because it's there. That was the sort of thing regarding the sussing out of the intricacies in the Canadian archipelago. And exactly at the same time, Sanford Fleming was exploring a route for the CPR, or Isaac Stevens for the Northern Pacific Railroad. A host of British explorers, Sir John Franklin being the most famous of them, were probing, again, principally from the Atlantic side, Franklin, but in fact, the fellow who had finally pieced the Northwest Passage together, named McClure, he actually approached it and discovered it, pieced it together, approaching it from the Pacific side of the Arctic, following the trajectory that Captain Cook had initially tried in 1778, but failed. But 150 years later, McClure was able finally to piece together a route. He wasn't able to sail it. He had to sledge over portions of it, a great deal of portions of it, from the Western Islands to exit out into Baffin Bay. But then, of course, as many of you might know, from 1903 to 1906, Roald Amundsen was able to finally transect the Northwest Passage of legend and lore. And today, seasonally at least, given the recession of the Arctic ice pack, there are many transits of the Northwest Passage made by commercial ships and recreational craft. And in fact, this will be my concluding point. We can go to questions at this stage. Given the rate of recession of the Arctic ice pack, it's possible that the Arctic might be ice-free, even including the North Pole itself for much of the year. The ice would only be seasonal in the deepest of winter. And in that sense, the Northwest Passage that Captain Cook was sent to find in 1778 might truly be revealed, rendering obsolete the Panama Canal, because ships will be able to go from Europe across North America to Asia without having to transect the Isthmus of Panama.